This is a video that I'm recording because in class we fell behind and we missed the Buchanan reading. We won't have time to catch up on that, so I'm making this overview, which is primarily intended for the online class, but I'll share it with the in-class version of our course too. So what I'll do is I'll do a quick overview of Buchanan, his argument and his ideas, hopefully to help you understand better and prepare better when moving forward. So, Buchanan's article, as the title suggests, deals with the relation between self-determination and military intervention. And Buchanan thinks that generally this relation is misunderstood. The way that most people think about it is roughly in the way that Walzer thinks about it, or some variation of the way that Walzer thinks about it. And that's as follows. It's either as thinking that, well, all states have a right to self-determination except in the most egregious, most horrible cases. That's Walzer's position. Then the right to self-determination is either overridden or it's emptied or something like that, and forfeited, and then intervention can become allowed. Or if you don't like that, you might go with Altman or Wellman and say, no, it's the same structure, but intervention is allowed in more cases, not only in the worst cases, but also in cases where countries don't adequately respect human rights. Now, what these views have in common, this is the thing that Buchanan is objecting to, is that they see intervention as a barrier to intervention. If they see self-determination as a barrier to intervention. And he thinks this is a mistake. Sometimes self-determination can be a barrier to intervention, but sometimes he thinks it's the opposite that's true. And it's not a barrier to intervention, but it's a reason for intervening. Now, to make this argument, Buchanan draws a distinction, that's a key distinction in his article, between negative and positive self-determination. And he thinks the mistake when people focus on the first of these two views that he distinguishes three in the beginning, but here are the first two on this page. The first two of these views make the mistake of focusing only on the negative side. And if you only focus on the negative side, then you will only see self-determination as a barrier, not a reason for intervention. And so he criticizes Walzer in particular. He says Walzer is very concerned about negative self-determination, but doesn't look at positive self-determination. And so that's why his view becomes the way it is. So here's the distinction between positive and negative self-determination. Negative self-determination, a country or a society or a group has negative self-determination when the group's affairs are not determined by others. This is very similar, if you remember, to the distinction I made between two kinds of freedom in Rousseau. There was negative liberty, which is just the absence of being forced by others or determined by others what you're going to do. Your actions being determined by others. If that's not the case, then you're free in a negative sense. But there is a more positive sense of liberty in play in Rousseau, which is requiring more than just that others don't determine your actions, but that you are actually in control. So it's possible that nobody else is actually in control, nobody else is autonomously deciding what you do, but that you're not really in control either. Sort of like a ball in the water being moved around by the waves. But to be truly free, Rousseau thinks you have to be more. You have to be yourself in control, and others have to be not in control. So you have to have positive and negative freedom. And here, for Buchanan, the same is true with self-determination. You have negative self-determination, just means no outside group is in control, just like Walzer requires. And then positive self-determination, because the group itself is actually in control. And that's the thing that Walzer ignores, he says. So, negative self-determination then can be obviously threatened by intervention, but also by outside authoritarian regimes, colonization, and so on. What might threaten positive self-determination? Well, it's going to be a range of things like this, right? It's going to be it's going to be things internal to the group that threaten to have the same effect as things that violate negative self-determination. So the threats of negative self-determination are that they undercut the group's ability to govern its own affairs from the outside. Well, positive self-determination is going to be threatened by things that do the same from the inside. So, a local authoritarian regime, a poorly designed or poorly functioning democratic regime, so one in which, for example, the voices of the people don't translate up to policy. Buchanan goes through quite some detail in explaining that self-determination will have to be with the people's voices somehow together determining their own policies, their own laws, their own affairs. And of course, a regime can look democratic and be democratic by all sort of formal measurements, but still function in a way that doesn't actually make that happen. Maybe certain small interest groups capture the government, or an elite actually controls it, and so on. You can have a democratically accepted constitution that undercuts future positive self-determination. So it might, for example, as Altman and Wellman accept, right, you might have a referendum that accepts that in the future there's not going to be any democracy anymore. And if that's enough to undercut future positive self-determination, then Buchanan will think, well, the positive self-determination to the group is actually violated or threatened. And finally, there might be more than one group with the right to self-determination that is forced to live together, and so its right to be independent would be violated then by that constitution. So those are a variety of things that all are going to be threats to positive self-determination. And these are things that Buchanan thinks can in principle be reasons for military intervention. So you can have a reason for military intervention that when there's an authoritarian regime, because what the point of intervention is to create the conditions for positive self-determination, or the means for positive self-determination. Put in place the kind of democracy or the kind of political system that allows the people to actually control its own affairs. Or there might be a democratic regime in place, but it's just not working, so that the people actually don't control their government. That might be a reason for outside military intervention to sort of fix that system and create the conditions where the people are actually in control, and so on down the list. Buchanan goes very, very carefully through a number of cases like this. All right, so we've seen the first two views, right? The first two views were where intervention is blocked by self-determination, and Buchanan says that's a mistake because it leaves out the positive side. The positive side can be a reason for, not just a barrier against intervention. So here's a third possible view that he distinguishes. You might think, oh, well, here is we should allow interventions to promote positive self-determination. So it might be that intervention can be justified or required to create the circumstances for self-determination. So you overthrow the thing that's harming, that is destroying the positive self-determination. You overthrow the authoritarian regime, or you overthrow the poorly functioning democratic regime. But many people think also that a requirement for self-determination holds that you can then not, as an outside force, start putting in place a new regime. You should let the people decide that. And that too, Buchanan thinks, actually is a mistake. It's a mistake because more is required to make positive self-determination happen than just removing the threats. So it's confusing two different things, right? One is the circumstances that allow for self-determination, which would be removing the authoritarian regime, for example. But the other thing is the means for self-determination, which are going to be like a better functioning regime. And B, the second thing, the actual means is what you need, he thinks. So if you can be justified, as this third view holds, in overthrowing to go for regime change, throw out Saddam Hussein in order to bring in an Iraqi democratic government, for example. Well, you shouldn't just stop and throw out Hussein. You should actually then build up the democratic government as well. That's his idea. So here's a summary of the argument. He starts from a beginning point, a starting point that he thinks we share, and then he works towards his own preferred conclusion. So here's the shared starting point. If something threatens negative self-determination, then the value of self-determination can justify military intervention. That's what even Walzer thinks. Authoritarian regimes, colonizing powers, etc. Threaten negative self-determination. Therefore, negative self-determination cannot justify military intervention to overthrow those type of things, colonizing powers and so on. Okay, that's the common thread. Here's how Buchanan then goes on. But if self-determination can justify intervention for negative self-determination, then it can also justify intervention for positive self-determination. That's a claim, by the way, right? That's, of course, it's a claim. You should ask yourself whether he's right about that. 5. Authoritarian regimes, problematic democratic constitutions, etc. can also threaten positive self-determination. Then it follows that the value of self-determination can justify military intervention to overthrow authoritarian regime, problematic democratic constitutions, these type of Altman and Wellman votes to abolish democracy, and so on. So it's a way, the argument here goes from an idea about intervention and self-determination that we share which is the idea that it's wrong for outsiders to impose political regimes on a group, and then tries to extend it and say, no, well, that's not going far enough. If you believe that, you should also believe something more, which is if we can remove the outsiders who are imposing their regimes, we should also then put in place the regime that actually puts the people who are being threatened by these outside regimes, put the people in charge. Right. The consequence of this for Buchanan is that you don't need the consent of the people to intervene. So consider the following two ideas here. A, when the people in an illegitimate state consent to outside intervention, this justifies intervention. And B, when the people do not give consent to intervention, this prohibits intervention. And Buchanan is like Altman and Wellman here, and he disagrees with both these ideas. So the question is why? I think when we look at that question, we'll see better what Buchanan's ideas about consent and self-determination really are. In short, before I go to the argument here, in short, Buchanan's idea is this. He thinks that when a country is positively self-determining, what is happening is that the people's voices or the people's ideas somehow translate up to the level of policy, law, and so on. And of course, when a country is positively self-determining, there is no reason of self-determination to intervene. But vice versa, so looking at it from the other side, when there is reason to intervene, that means the people's voices aren't in charge of the country. But if the people's voices aren't in charge of the country, then how could the people actually consent to or prohibit intervention? So basically the idea is when intervention is even an issue, consent is not going to be valid. It's not going to be really the people's will that you're hearing. So here's roughly how the argument might go. So if consent can justify or prohibit intervention, then it must be really genuinely given by the people. And if the people can give their valid consent, then there must be a way for their voices to be heard. Okay. Together then follows 3 that therefore if consent can justify or prohibit intervention, then it must be true that the people's voices can actually be heard. However, if the people's voices can be heard, then positive self-determination is also possible. And so then it follows that if consent can actually justify or prohibit intervention, like claims A and B there said, then positive self-determination must be possible. So now to the claim, right? If intervention to promote self-determination is justifiable, then positive self-determination must be impossible, Because if it's possible, then there is no reason to intervene for self-determination reasons. And then you put that together, then 7 follows. If intervention to promote self-determination is justifiable, like Buchanan says, then consent cannot prohibit or justify intervention. And that's just a formalized version of the idea that I was just explaining. Right? The idea being that if the people are actually in control, then there is no reason to intervene. But if there is reason to intervene, then, well, the people aren't in control, which means they're not in a position to consent or not consent. All right. That's roughly the overview of the main points that are playing a role in Buchanan's argument. Here are 2 questions I want to leave you with. 2 questions just to think about what to do with something like Buchanan's argument and whether he's right or not. Here's one possible critique or way of resisting what Buchanan is saying. Let's say that there is a distinction between 2 things. Something that's a value that calls for us to respect it, and something, a value that calls for us to promote it, like produce more of it. So the first one would be like not destroy it, the other one would be make more of it be in place or exist. So think about the value of life, right? Like, okay, life is valuable, we all agree it is. What does that mean? Does it mean we should respect life and not kill it? Or should we promote it by just producing more and more people? Like, you care about life, okay, does that mean you should have as many kids as possible? Of course not. Right? It means don't kill it when it exists, but it doesn't necessarily mean producing more and ever more and more of it. Now, Buchanan seems to be thinking that the value of life then is very different from the value of self-determination, because he thinks actually the value of self-determination requires that you promote it. You should bring about more of it. That's what a positive self-determination, right? Walzer seems to think that the value of self-determination is more like the value of life. When it's in place, you have to respect it and not intervene from the outside and thereby damage it. But he does not think that you should go around promoting it through regime change and so on. Don't kill it is something that's required, but you're not required to produce ever more. That's not what Buchanan thinks. Buchanan thinks, no, self-determination, if you care about the value, you should be producing more of it. Is that correct? One way to think about it, and I don't know, right? This is a question you should ask yourself. One way to formulate this question is think about it this way. Think about a society in which things aren't that bad, but it's not self-determining. So if things were really bad, that would be a reason for intervention. But things, let's say, are not horrible, but there was no self-determination going on. Would that be a good enough reason for military intervention? Buchanan's argument seems committed to the answer, yes. That's up to you. All right, so here's a second question. We started with the intuition, that's the intuition that Walzer has, which is about negative self-determination, that self-determination is violated when outsiders impose a regime. So regime change violates self-determination. That's Walzer's intuition. But now we're seeing the view from Buchanan that when outsiders put in place the means for positive self-determination, so a truly democratic regime, say, that's supposed to be respect for or regard for self-determination. But are they not also just imposing a regime? This seems paradoxical, right? Like, regime change was supposed to be a violation of self-determination, but now it's actually required by self-determination. Now, if it's not just a paradox, not just an apparent contradiction, but an actual problem, then Buchanan must be confused, and maybe he's confused between respecting and promoting a value, for example. But if not, then we should think, well, were we confused about self-determination? Then it follows that imposing a new regime is not always a violation of self-determination. And if that's true, then maybe we should think in a richer or slightly different way about what self-determination really means. All right. Well, those are things to think about. If you have any questions, as always, just let me know.